It's a bit strange to welcome you because we actually know each other. Sort of seems like
it's very nice to be here.
You know, whatever. But I mean, I was struck by when I wrote to you asking for your, the books you'd recommend. You didn't just send me the 2 recommendations. You sent me this whole kind of essay on this whole list of. I always wanted to just publish your email or all these recommendations. One of which I've immediately followed up. But let's start with the Austin. What made you choose that?
So I come from Bath, and like many people who did English A-level in the 80s, and I'm not sure whether she's still regularly set, but Austin was set as a text, and I had one of my first experiences of sort of very profound rapport with those novels, both because I could tell they were sort of unavoidably my cup of tea in terms of comic tone. I don't know whether it's a blessing or a curse, but I'm a fairly good mimic, and that's part of the reason that I wrote The Absent Therapist, for want of a stage to actually perform on. I decided I'd have to use the page and sort of do different voices. And I think one of the things that's not often remarked about Austen is the excellence of her ear in dialogue, but also in the sense of speech imported into reported prose. Sometimes you can't quite tell the difference. And also in letters. I felt it was really something that I might at some point in life be able to emulate. That thing you have, I think if you want to do any kind of creative endeavour, regardless of where you are, whether you're a beginner or whether you've been writing or painting for a very long time, certain other painters and paintings and materials come into view at the right point, and everything sort of drops into focus. And you sense a sort of rightness of attention that you can give to that person, such was the case with Austen. And this particular novel, Persuasion, I also find incredibly moving. I'm just listening to Lawrence read it over there, again almost in tears. It's like all her books, diamond hard really, as well as being funny. And it's the novel of second chances. It is also the novel of feeling measured against the formal constraints of not just society and title and expectation and class, but the constraints of what can be said, speech, public diction and comportment, Augustan seriousness. How do you get your feelings out in that world? How do you make them known when they are pressingly real? The marriage circus by which Anne is surrounded is about money. It is about feelings, but they come quite a long way down the list. It's about ensuring, succession and legacies and status and all these things. And her novels are very, very fascinating discussions of how you can also get feelings into the marketplace, as it were. And this is the rawest of the novels, I think, because really Anne's time is past. In the outset, we hear that she's, her bloom has faded. Captain Wentworth comes back on the scene. He wasn't a rich man when she first met him and loved him. Now he is. Now he's no longer nobody, but he declares her to have altered beyond recognition. And it doesn't look good, really. And she has to sort of bear his company and his nearness, knowing that she's past her best. And of course, things turn around, and in actual fact, what a surprise, they get together. But it's wonderfully well done, and the letter is, a letter, if we think about it, when we write a letter to someone, if someone's died, if we want to reach out to someone because we love them and there's just no other way to say what we can say. It's a very high stakes game because it's an idealized mode of expression where you hope that you will be able to say exactly what you want to say, and it is also a sort of harrowing mode of expression because you find that given all the time and patience and attention in the world, you still can't. It just doesn't go into words. And Frederick Wentworth is writing this while the room is full of other things going on, and the circumstances are less than ideal, and all the things he really wants to say, he sort of can't quite get in the right order, but it's his only opportunity. And I don't know, I just find that incredibly moving, and it's also an interesting sort of light on Austen's own life and her writing process, because of course she wrote a lot of her books with a lot of family life going on around her in less than ideal situations, and indeed when she started being published, and Sense and Sensibility was the first novel to be published, I think it was her aunt who they simply couldn't fathom this person who'd just been apparently scribbling at a desk had produced this extraordinary work. And I think the aunt said it's as if the poker near the fireplace had got up and started speaking. So she wrote in Less Than Ideal Circumstances. Wentworth is forced to say what he really means in Less Than Ideal Circumstances, and there's something for all of us in that.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So. And the Bishop, that wonderful Bishop, and one of my favourite Bishop poems.
The Bishop is
very different.
Very different. I first started reading Bishop. Poetry was the first thing I really wrote when I was very, very young, and then I dropped it for many years. And I really came back to poetry when I was travelling across America. Half my family's American, but I had not really met them. And then I went over there when I was 18, and I had family on both coasts, and I went across the States on my own on trailways, which was and is a 3-4 day journey, and you're on this bus for a very, very long time. You'll probably change at Chicago and get another one to Florida, but it's a big deal, and you used to stop at least at very, very out of the way places. Nebraska is just essentially 1,000 miles of corn. That's what it is. And you would stop at little filling stations, and they're just like that. And it was on the way back that I think I picked a volume of her poetry off my aunt's shelf and started reading it, and it was as if that particular poem had fallen in my lap to describe part of my experience that I'd been through. And of course it is hugely different to the Austen, except that it's also about a lost, it seems to me to be in part about there's a lost presence hovering over the whole thing, and that is the somebody, the somebody who made the sort of daisy stitch and the crochet. And when you ask yourself who is missing from the poem, I think the answer is the mother. And so it's a poem that has acquired a refreshed meaning for me. I lost my mother 10 years ago in unpleasant, the circumstances are often unpleasant. How could they not be? But this was a poem that was powerfully consoling.
And of course Bishop's own mother.
Yeah.
So why do you think, you're one of the many writers who've chosen Bishop. What do you think it is? She seems so important, doesn't she, for contemporary poetry particularly. Do you got any thought why that is?
I think she is observationally acute and sensitive to the natural world. But I think that she also has an extraordinary kind of, and the sensitivity there is the sensitivity of sympathy and feeling. Mm. But I think that the acuteness is also scientific and almost taxonomic. Mm. You know, she'll take you through the sandpiper. Mm. She'll take you through the little sort of behaviours and gestures of the bird and the composition of the sand, the mica and the quartz, and that's how the poem ends. Mm. She's quite difficult to pin down. Mm. And the relationship in the poems, I think, between the felt and the forensic, if you like, is a bit like the relationship, you know, between the lived experience. A lot of them come out of, you know, her personal experience and her experience in Brazil, and the imaginary. And what she says to me, at least, is that it's impossible to have a fully lived experience or a memory that is not also imaginary. Mm. Mm.
Interesting. So we better move on to you, otherwise. But let's move on to you. You know, you mentioned your mother just there, and I was struck in the Inevitable Gift Shop. I mean, there's so many different elements to that, aren't there? But there's a moment where you talk about regretting the grievances of adolescence, I think you call it. And you said that the hardest one to talk about was a story about your mother. I just wonder whether you might introduce us to her and to that story. I was very struck by it.
Yes, I might have to use a crib note, i.e. the book, so I can remember what I said.
I can't remember what page it's on.
Yeah, my mother was an artist. Well, she was a very good draftswoman and a painter and a very good seamstress. Her mother worked in a sweatshop in North London. So my family was a sort of not unfamiliar post-war melange of the very poor working class and the middle class. So my father came from a middle class background, and my mother came from a very poor background. But she'd been a scholarship girl. She'd gone to hybrid school for girls, and then she'd gone to teach training college, where she met my father, and they were both artists. My father continued to be an artist and still is, and is still alive. And my mother, as so many of her generation did, really gave it up in order to bring up a large, difficult to control family. And she was extremely intelligent woman. She was, I think, a melancholic. And some of that might have come from the fact that she had to, abandon is too dramatic a word, but put down a great deal of what had made her her. And actually sort of schooled herself into thinking that it couldn't really have been real, or that she wasn't entitled to do these things, and they were very, very clearly and must be secondary to the business of being a mother, which of course she took very seriously. But nonetheless, I think actually not having that ability to work as an artist probably was quite damaging for her. And I think that's a shame, but it's not unusual in that generation. And she was a marvellous teacher too, and she was a spontaneous and extremely funny person. And I was the beneficiary of that. And she wasn't bookish. There weren't. My parents read, but there weren't lots and lots of books. It's more that she had a very kind of direct line to the natural world, and we had a little garden, and she sort of taught me how to, plant seeds and propagate things, and that's remained very important. And actually, I've never really enforced much of a distinction between those seasonal processes of propagation and planting in gardens and the mental activity of writing. They seem to me to belong together in some way. So she was a woman who, she loved her family. She absolutely loved us when we were children. I mean, she loved us always, but I think that she got a great deal from the formative stages of her children's life, and I think it was more difficult for her when once we began to sort of develop adult characteristics and become the people in a way she primed us to be. I think that was not as satisfying for her, because it was, as is it for a lot of us, it was a confrontation that was at once lovely and fulfilling and a little alarming. Suddenly there is this person who you have brought into the world and nurtured and taught and helped and loved, and they are quite different. And as they become adults, of course, a sort of broken symmetry emerges. That you can see exactly in the developing adult, you can see what it was that you loved and unconditionally in the infant, except that there are now conditions. And that's, I think, hard. And I think she found it particularly hard because perhaps she hadn't felt loved enough herself, and so the conditional adult didn't, I think, satisfy her in quite the same way. It's not that she didn't love us, but...
And the story that you...
Yeah, sorry. Okay. There are plenty of things I would like to say to Cecily now that I can't say because it is too late. I read an article about homosexuality at an impressionable age, which as usual pinned my orientation on attachment to the mother. I knew she pitied homosexuals. She often said she didn't mind them, but it was no life when you got older. And I didn't want to be pitied, so I withdrew. I no longer came to her in the morning with tea. I grew rude and impatient. I gossiped with my siblings. The cultured grievances of adolescence are banal, and I will regret mine for the rest of my life because they hurt someone vulnerable. But the thing I find hardest to write is this. She told me a story once about her own childhood. A well-disposed teacher at Highbury School for Girls had suggested she read aloud at the end of term assembly. The headmistress called my mother in to her office and gave her a passage of Shakespeare to recite, a sonnet, I think, possibly sonnet 143, the rather Dutch portrait of the housewife with the crying infant in one arm, reaching for a chicken with the other. My mother began reading, and after only a few words the head interrupted her. "Stop! Stop! No more, please! I can't bear to listen to any more of that ghastly Cockney accent." I could tell from the tremor in my mother's voice and a brief involuntary over-enunciation that she was telling me something painful, looking at a scar. It would have been better if I'd laughed, or said, boring, or raised my eyes heavenwards. But I didn't say anything. I said nothing to her. Next to me on the desk as I write is a young girl, bright-eyed and falling off the end of her school photograph, betrayed into silence by who she was.
Thank you, that's wonderful, really wonderful. And in that, you talk about being gay. Was that, what was your childhood like, and what was coming out? And do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, it was a.
Did you have a literary childhood, sort of thing?
Did I have a
literary childhood?
No, I didn't. My brother was a terrific writer and reader. I think, you know, we got on very well when I was very young. I think, I was someone, again, it was the sense of me being very young and someone who could be moulded. And I think he was and is a very sensitive person. And I think he really enjoyed that sense of a brother who was 7 years younger, who he could sort of induct in the ways of books and reading. And he had this, I remember this wonderful shelf of just very smart looking black Penguin classics. And, I'm afraid it was, I just thought, don't those look great? I'd like to read those one day. I mean, I had no idea what they were about. And indeed, I got a bit of a shock when I pulled Suetonius off the shelf and started reading some of that, because quite racy and violent. But no, he was very important. I mean, the memory, we shared a room, and the memory of him writing his essays under a sort of lamp, and he wrote in a very, very beautiful script. In a beautiful hardback book, and the sort of the aesthetic fetishism of the book and the paper and the ink, it was very important and romantic, and it might surprise my friends to hear this, but I am quite romantic. So that was the literary part. Being gay, I was quite extrovert. We've had a conversation about this before. I mean, similarly to you, both shy and quite extrovert. And I was, as I said, a good mimic early on. So although I was a very small boy at school, and I was a year in front of, a year behind everyone else, in front, because I was a year younger, at a time when there were very large roles and big classes, I sort of got away with being the youngest, and I would normally, at a big comprehensive school, have been the one who got bullied. But I got away with most of that because, and wasn't bullied particularly badly, a little bit, but I think because I had a pretty ready wit and I could stand my ground, and also I could, sort of the shock of the people about to sort of, pan your head in, Eaves, I'm going to pan your head in. And then, of course, you talk back to them in their voice, which sort of stops people. And then they then it's a bit mysterious. It's a bit of theatre. It's what's going to happen, hear this voice coming back at me. So that was a way of surviving school, but there wasn't ever any doubt about me being gay. I knew that very early on. And I think it was it's always a tricky thing, coming to those realizations in anybody's life at any point. I think not I think as difficult now. Depends on the context, depends upon whether you're in a town or city or whether you're remote. But I think in the mid-80s, early 80s, at the start of the AIDS pandemic, it was particularly problematic because you had very strong, memory. Every day you went back, and the famous advertising campaign, once news about the pandemic got out, of just any kind of sex, became pathologized, but particularly gay sex. And the advertising campaign was of a gravestone falling over. That's right. With the word AIDS on it, etched deep. So at the very point at which you're learning about your impulses and about your sexual preferences and feeling attracted, to people, never mind really whether it's your own sex or not, you're also being told that the people you are attracted to could kill you. So that, I think, enforced a sort of very watchful kind of circumspection on me. I think I learned to hide things very, very well, and I think that wasn't very good for me. I think it's taken me a long time to unpick that. And to be honest, I think it probably had quite a lot to do with my delayed adolescence, as it were, in my mid-20s to mid-30s, being very promiscuous.
Mm.
Pretty. Sorry. Fairly extravagantly so.
Mm.
And I think it was that sense of making up for lost time
Of course.
that was wrapped up in it.
Mm. So when did writing enter all this? When you mentioned earlier on that poetry is what you started reading. When did writing did poetry? Because you've written poetry and prose, and for you seem to cross. You seem to me to be someone who wants to blur the boundary. We'll come to Murmur in a minute, but some of it's written in sprung rhythm, which is incredible achievement. When did writing first kind of enter? And was it poetry?
I think it was both, actually. I think that they were sort of. I do think of them as. Actually, it was Peter Porter, the Australian poet, who, when I worked at the TLS for many years, and Peter became a very good friend. He's sort of in loco parentis, really. I was very, very fond of Peter. Very funny, brilliant man. Very kind. Kind to me. And he used to say, poetry and prose, what I admire about you is the horses in adjoining stalls. And I think that's probably right, so Austin, very important when I was an adolescent. Also the happenstance acquisitions of going around, bookshops and finding things that I could afford to buy. Kind of rather random acquisitions, because you had a bit of pocket money, and so I look forward to Saturday morning. That was my thing. I'd just go into town, go round back when a town had like 4 or 5 bookshops, and I'd get. I don't know. I got the Adventures of Marco Polo. I bought some Edward Thomas, I think. Similarly, when I got to university, long reading list of terribly worthy and boring sort of post-structuralist stuff that I already knew I wasn't going to read. I did in the end come back to it, but much later on. Instead, I went into Bevis as an 18-year-old, and actually some Auden was, it was an old Faber edition, so it was very cheap. So it's a very unglamorous and sort of rather thrifty approach to reading, and that's how I began to read widely. It was I didn't have a sense of who the right people to read might be. And although I was quite voracious, I think I was also quite a slow reader, so I tended to reread from the word goes. So if I was to actually mention poets, I think it would be Edward Thomas, Auden, Walter de la Mare, Elizabeth Jennings, quite odd things. There was poems of the late Tang, which was an early Penguin classic. Arthur Waley, translator. Chinese poetry, Babylonian poetry. Weird, and films, and lyrics, hugely important when I was growing up. I like every teenager, I listened to a lot of pop music, and although I was I played the piano a bit badly, but I played it a bit. But actually, really, the music that meant a lot to me was 60s R&B. It was Stevie Wonder and Aretha Franklin, and So
and then let's move to the work a bit. I was going to brings me on to the inevitable gift shop, and you call it a memoir by other means. One of the things that struck me about it is like you sort of want to accommodate everything in it, high and low, real feeling, Like the beautiful thing you just read, real feeling, but also sort of philosophical thought. And I reading through the last 3 volumes, that's one of the things that struck me about your work generally, is that you seem to be somebody who wants to include, who wants to feel things a lot, but also wants to think things a lot, who wants to just include things. Is that your sense of the inevitable gift shop?
Yeah, it is. The inevitable gift shop itself is, funnily enough, I think a lot of it is powered by, I feel already I've come over as a bit of a sober side, but actually a lot of it is powered by essentially a comic instinct. I think that's my observational starting point of a lot of things. And so the inevitable gift shop was a thing that this Icelandic tour guide had said when I was in Iceland. There's this sort of tour you can do where you go around all the sort of the geysers and the golden circle tourist when you sounds vaguely Buddhist, doesn't it? Not. And you do this thing, and then you end up at something they call the Garden of Eden.
As you would, yeah.
The Garden of Eden in Iceland, which has such a sort of short growing period, is a greenhouse. And it's a greenhouse with really not all that much in it. But the Icelandics have got a great sense of humour. And he said, Garden of Eden, if you go through past the sort of few dusty cacti and a few herbs, you will come to the inevitable gift shop. So that's it. Everything is in the gift shop, but it's also the sort of prize at the end of a not necessarily very exciting journey. Which I think is more or less like life.
Right, yeah.
That's what I think that is. I am drawn to philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, but I am drawn to that kind of intense evaluation of things, because I want to, it's not really getting it right, I want to understand why a problem is a problem. Not really interested in the solutions. I'm interested in why something proposes itself as a difficulty.
We better move on to Murmur, your wonderful novel that you're going to be launching tonight. And first thing, of course, I wanted to ask you is, what drew you to Alan Turing? I don't know very much about him at all, apart from the film that fairly recently came out and looking at Wikipedia. But what drew you to him? What was the sort of spark there?
A kind of series of accidents, really. I actually wrote a chapter of the book when I was in Australia about 6 or 7 years ago, and I was very much in love with someone, and had been with David for 2 years, a bit more, and I felt that something was going wrong. That sense you have. There's this sort of, you think, I'd gone to Australia on my own to write, and I suddenly felt bereft there. I thought, this isn't. I'm not going to be able to retrieve this. This is not going to work. And having flown 11,000 miles, I couldn't sort of really, just sort of go straight back and do something about it. So I was sort of stuck. And I wrote this chapter of someone who was about a man stuck in a room, wondering how he'd got there and indeed who he was. And it sounds rather sophomoric and rather odd, and having a sort of hypersensitivity to his surroundings and to the sort of ghosts of his imagination and the early morning and the light coming through the window and a desk with work on it that he's sort of abandoned, and a sense that suddenly this place of refuge, his room, is really no longer a place of refuge but a bit of a prison. And then so I wrote that without thinking about Turing at all. Then quite independently someone sent me Sarah Turing, Turing's mother's memoir, that she wrote a few years after his suicide. And that really introduced the whole story to me. And in this business of something coming into focus, within range, and thinking, this is actually what I'm writing about, without knowing it. Something has been set in train, unconsciously or subconsciously. And my feeling about books is that once you realise that's happened, the die is cast, and you are committed to it. Or if not, you'd better drop it quickly. And I went on a conference about Turing's work, and I found completely fascinating various components of his life. We know about Bletchley Park. So Alan Turing famously is the head of a team at Bletchley Park that broke the German naval enigma code, which effectively foreshortened the war in the Atlantic, kept us going, supplies managed, allowed for supplies to keep going here. We were months away from starvation. So he played a very significant role in shortening the war. 1952, 7 years after the war, his interests moved on from the practical business of cryptanalysis to being very heavily invested in pattern formation, the interface between biology and mathematics, thinking very much also about what we would now call early artificial intelligence, the capacities of the computer, what the computer might become. Writes a very famous paper for Mind magazine called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in which he sort of revolutionarily suggests that there isn't necessarily an obvious limit to the capacities of the computer, and introduces something called the Turing test, which became very famous and features essentially in Blade Runner many years later, in which the idea of the Turing test is that a blind human interrogator asks a set of questions to a mechanical respondent and a human respondent, and because he can't tell which is which, he has to determine from the answers which is which. And the point at which we will be able to say with some confidence that machines have acquired some operative human level intelligence will be the point at which you can't distinguish between the two. Now, in fact, no machine to this date has really... There were some news stories last year. The Turing test still stands. We haven't really superseded it yet. But one of the problems with that, and what I found interesting in the book, is that, in writing the book, is that really it's not necessarily just about intelligence. We're looking at behaviour rather than intelligence. One of the interesting things, the thing that got me going, was that it's human-like behaviour that is supposed to equal intelligence in Turing's book. So it's just what you can observe that will indicate whether or not a machine is a robot is intelligent or not. But in fact, it doesn't take very much to add to that a thought experiment in which you think about people who have no behaviour left at all because they've had strokes or because they're extremely ill, and yet they have very alive internal mental awareness. Or people whose behaviour is one thing and the mental life is another. Or people who have a full range of operational and behavioural characteristics, but who might have nothing going on inside at all. I don't mean just idiots. I mean zombies, as it were. Machines without consciousness. So the field opens up. That is where we are still, really, in philosophy of mind. And I kind of felt that the experience that Turing had when he was convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to this terrible business of taking this hormone which changed his body, made him grow breasts, it was an enormously difficult physical process for him. But I wonder how it would have changed also his view on computing machinery and intelligence, how he would have then revisited all the issues of what it is either to be a human or a machine. So that's really what the book is about. Under the stress of this terrible thing that's happened to him. How do you fit all the personal paraphernalia, the sort of individual point of view of suffering into this hitherto scientific material world? How is he going to do that? And that's the story of the book, you know, how he finds room for his own suffering.
And with great, I mean, one of the things that struck me about the book, and it's Turing, at least in the book, is his moral character.
Yeah.
Very, very striking.
I think he was a person of exemplary probity.
I mean, it's certainly in the book. It comes. It's a book about decency.
Yeah.
A book about honour. It's a book about subtlety, intelligence, curiosity.
Well, I remember something you said on the retreat that I went on last year, which is you said that sometimes the Buddha could be quite a terrifying person. He wasn't necessarily nice. And I don't mean that Turing was a nice person. I don't think he was particularly nice. I think he was very difficult, sort of embattled person. But I think he was properly decent. You know, there's that word that has become bastardized in the you know, the lips of people who shall not be named in a Buddhist temple. But you know, I think that he was he had the concerns of others, you know, interestingly enough, foremost in his mind.
I mean, it comes over very strongly in the novel. That, I mean, the other thing that I was thinking about the novel is, again, it's written in fragments. It's got these incredible dream sequences. Then there's bits of journal, fragmentary. The fragments go all the way again through your work. I was noticing there's a lot of concern for fragment.
Well, I like when you think of fragments, you think, oh, it's something must be broken, but actually, that's not really how I see it. I think that I think all novels are fragmentary, really, and indeed, it's an ancient composite art form, the mosaic, and rather like the relationship between the micro world and the macroscopic object in physics, the world up close looks very, very different and, you know, sometimes extremely incoherent, but pull back and suddenly a classical picture comes into view and you have a sort of coherent picture. So the mosaic says something very profound about the nature of reality.
And the other thing that struck me about the novel, it's also a novel about loneliness. It struck me.
Yeah.
And that loneliness is slightly a theme. You know, the creative artist is someone who has to work alone in a way, and there's a regret in that. I don't know. There's quite a strong sense of loneliness. In one point, you say, "There is no justice in the world, and we are alone." In one of the letters, for instance. Yeah.
I mean, I hope it's. Oh God, it does sound bleak, doesn't it? I mean, it is a very sad story.
It's a terribly sad story.
It's a terribly sad story. But I think it was my intention also to kind of write a consoling book. Because I think that, I mean, I think that's right. I'm afraid the idea we're, sold that there is this thing called justice is, I mean, it's the thing we can aspire towards, and it's something we should practice and pursue in our own lives, but it is not, it's not evidentially secure. It's not necessarily going to come looking for us. We may not encounter it.
He certainly didn't.
And he certainly didn't. And I'm afraid that is just the way of things. And the sooner I sort of feel this, not the sooner, but it is one of the tasks of life, no matter who you are, to face up to that.
Let's draw this to close. I wanted you to sort of finish by, because we'll be hearing from Murmur later. Why do you write?
I write because I write because it's something that I've done for a long time now, and the kind of neural pathways have been set, and that's what I do, and I have a sort of choice over it, of course, but it's sort of attenuated choice. God, who was it who said seems a perfectly decent way of passing the time. I think it was Borges. I think it was Borges. So I think there's that. But more seriously, I think I also have written to make a shape of things. I mean, I teach, and I'm never very happy about trying to teach plot, character, all the discrete elements of writing, because I don't know what they are really. But I do think that making a shape, making some coherence, fighting against entropy, and the second law, matters to me, and I think that is part of that's part of the human struggle, and I think it's also a way of writing isn't necessarily a kind of intellectual exercise, although I do, and I like philosophy. I think it's mark making in the same way that painting is mark making. It's just a different kind of mark making. It has an operation in time that is more pronounced than I think than painting. But the leaving something behind is part of it. But it's not to do with having a body of work. I don't really care about that, and I don't care what happens to my work when I'm gone, or even really in 10, 15 years' time. Particularly, I have a pardonable vanity about it in the moment, but it doesn't go on that long, fortunately. But I do think that there is some human satisfaction to be had from just getting it out, whatever it is.
It's a great place to finish. Thank you very much, Will Eaves.